All right, good afternoon. Thank you for attending the latest CAPE presentation, and sorry for the slight delay. I am Joe Martin, a member of the Executive Committee of CAPE, and I'm pleased this afternoon to welcome you to take part in Carol Kammen's presentation. Carol will be speaking for about 45 minutes. We will allow time afterwards for a Q&A. The easiest way to participate in the question and answer portion is to use the chat feature in your Zoom application. You can use at any point during the talk, type in a comment or a question. I will be able to see that, I hope, and then can share those comments and questions with Carol at the end of her talk. As a matter of courtesy, before we begin, please make sure that the mute button on your Zoom application, in fact, is muted, and we can then proceed. Since 1965, Carol has been living in Ithaca, and during that time has forged a career of many dimensions as educator, as historian, as journalist, as archive researcher. She taught at Ithaca High School early on in her career at TC3, and for 25 years, she was a member of the Department of History, a senior lecturer, teaching, in my awareness, a first-year writing seminar in local history. I was involved for many years in the enrollment protocol of first-year writing seminars, and I knew that local history was one of our more attractive offerings, semester in and semester out. In her other career, she embodied the concept of local history. She wrote a column for the Ithaca Journal on local history for 40 years, and since the year 2000, she has been the Tompkins County historian. More recently, however, Carol has embarked upon a third or fourth career, now a novelist, and she'll be speaking today about her first novel, I think, Lamentations, and discussing the role of local history in generating the theme of this novel. So, Carol?
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to do this. I'm a little scared. In some ways, I think I've slipped into the dark side. I know historians who do not read historical fiction, and I know historians who think very dimly of it. I always thought of myself as a historian, so I have to talk more about myself at first, which I never do, because my story starts in fourth grade. I somehow skipped classes in fourth grade. I don't know how you do that, and spent a lot of time in the library. And I read through all of the Orange biographies put out by Bobbs Merrill, John Adams, Sam Adams, George Washington, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln. And then I came across one on Narcissa Whitman. She was the only female in this group of orange-clad Bobbs Merrill biographies. And that led me to begin to read about going west. And I discovered a series of books that no one seems to remember called Caddy Woodlawn, a little girl who lived on the Wisconsin frontier as the Sioux Indians were being pushed out by settlers. And I found the whole story tremendously interesting. And I went on to read all the good Western writers, Wallace Stegner, Yvonne Doig, Bernie DeVoto, A.B. Guthrie. There are just a lot of them. I read some of the bad ones too, like Zane Grey. Not bad, but not the same class with Stegner. And then the trail grew cold and I grew up. I went to college, I got married, and we moved to Ithaca in 1965. And suddenly the trail got hot again, which was very interesting. As all of you know, or some of you know, if you go down Seneca Street, there's a small street near the bottom called Parker Street. And on Parker Street, there's a historic marker. That marker has been destroyed. Someone apparently took it down. But the marker was to Samuel Parker, who went in 1835 to the West to find places for missionaries, because he believed that it was the Christian duty of people to go West and bring education and government and all the good things that we had to the people in the West, to the Indians in the West. And they were all called Indians without distinction of tribe for a long time. So Parker did that, and that was interesting. And then down by the Presbyterian Church in a little dark alcove, there's a monument to Narcissa and Marcus Whitman, who left to go west in 1836 at Parker's behest. They also married because he told them to. They went west, and Narcissa and the other missionary couple with them, the Spaldings, were called the first two white women to cross the Rockies. This might or might not be true, but it's what Narcissa gets claim for. Narcissa and Marcus went out and established a mission station at Lopway. And so that was interesting to me. I had these two interesting connections to going west in Ithaca. And then in Lansingville, there's a very curious marker to Dr. Elijah White. It says missionary to the Indians. That was interesting. I began to follow the career of Dr. Elijah White, thinking he sounded like a great missionary doctor. And I dug into his career and found out he wasn't quite as wonderful as the sign in Lansingville says. He was fired from the Methodist mission for pressing his female patients. Nobody will tell me what pressing means, but it doesn't sound like a good thing. And I think a number of men have been accused recently of pressing females one way or another. So Elijah White comes back from Oregon in disgrace with the Methodists, but once he gets to the East, he becomes one of the few people in the East who knows anything about the Pacific Northwest, and he gets called to Washington. And he goes to see President Polk, and he sees John Spencer, the Secretary of War. And they're very interested in Oregon because the United States and Great Britain were contesting for that period of that piece of land in the Pacific Northwest. And I went to school believing that 54-40 and fight meant that we got 54, but we didn't. We got 49, the 49th parallel. But how we got it is an interesting story, and White is involved in that story. So Spencer, Secretary of War, turns to White and says, could you go back and become the federal agent there, especially in charge of the Indians? And White said, of course I'll go. And Spencer says, and what about taking some families so we can populate the area? Because the Canadians were moving in, and we didn't want to, the Canadians would be allied with the British, and we wanted our guys, a big present for our guys. And White says, sure, of course I can. I will get a wagon train and I will take people west. But White had never been west across the country. He had gone by ship. So he sets out and he gets himself to St. Louis and puts some notices in the newspaper, and about 109 people show up. I did a lot of research at the Huntington Library, the National Archives, Oregon Historical Society, Yale, Cornell, and I found the story of Elijah White. He is, by and large, not held in high esteem by most historians, and he's pretty much written out of the picture. Joe mentioned to me that he had a copy of Rinker Buck's very popular book about the Oregon Trail, which is two brothers having a romp going across the country, recreating it. It's very male, it's very positive, it's very egocentric. And Joe said to me, but White doesn't appear in it. And White doesn't appear because the trail, the company that Elijah White took west in 1842 never got to Oregon City as a group. They didn't get their wagons west. So Oregon traces the trail history to 1843, the year that Marcus Whitman brought 900 people to Oregon. That was a big deal. So here we have Elijah White, and I'm interested in this 1842 trail. And so I wrote a really, really boring history. And then I put it aside and I did lots of other things. And then about 3 years ago, I was bitten by some wonderful Ithaca insect and had a very hard time that summer and couldn't sleep. And so every night I got up and I started to write the story of what happened, or what the women on this party going west must have thought about. So the events in Lamentation are almost all, from the trail diary that was kept by the agent who worked with Dr. White. His name was Madoram Crawford, and he goes on to be a very significant man in Oregon's history after he gets himself west. So there is a trail diary, and they are the chapter headings in Lamentations. And then 60 years after people got to Oregon in 1842, in the 1890s, 1910, 4 people gave oral histories or memoirs of what they thought had happened on this trail. And so I have 109 people going west. There were a dozen women, and there's not one word by them or about them, except in one of the memoirs. So I took the history I knew, and I took the dozen women, and I wondered how they thought about going west. And so what I tried to do was not to make a 21st century woman out of these people, but try to be true to the 19th century. So they had no role in company decisions. There's no woman in 1842 who saves the day. What they did was walk. They walked every day from 9 to 22 miles a day, depending on the weather, depending on the topography, depending on what wagons were working or what wagons were not working. And my questions were, what did they think about while they were doing this? They did not have time to gather together because they had to walk and keep their wagons and their families and the children from not being run over, and they had to make the trip. They didn't spend a lot of time talking to each other, I'm pretty sure. And what they did have was time to think in a way that women really didn't have time to think, or don't have time to think, when they have daily chores and daily lives. So I wanted to know what they thought about that they couldn't talk about with other people, other women especially. I wanted to represent the difficulties of the trail, but I was not interested in buckets and wagons and wheels and all of that. I was really interested in how these women walked their way across the country, what they thought of what they saw, how they managed, and what happened to them. I looked at the trail, at the company in 1842, as a hyphen between these women's old lives and the new lives that they were going to have to build in Oregon. So in some ways, it's like a classroom where people, I think I just got blanked out, but that's all right with me, if you can hear me. I think about them as a classroom. Sometimes you sit next to a person next to you and he says he's from Ohio. Sometimes you sit next to someone else and he says he's studying botany. There is a way in which you know people slightly, but not totally. And my interest was how these women work together or not. I was interested in different economic classes, different opinions, different ages. And so I put them all together. And for 2 or 3 years, they lived in my head and talked to me. And now that they're on paper, I miss them very much. So I think there are two big problems. One is writing history or writing fiction as a historian. And I really didn't find that a challenge, but I have been challenged by some historians about it. And the other big issue for me has to do with how someone in the 21st century deals with Native Americans. Because the people going west really regarded them, or disregarded them is probably the way to put it, as in the way or inconsequential people to whom they are bringing something, but not people they saw as having a culture or something to give these white people going west. The people on the trail in 1842 had to have enough money to create, to buy a wagon and to get themselves outfitted. 2 of the families did not have very much money, but were taken along because Elijah White wanted to take as many people as possible. And I saw economic differences, social differences between these women, and I wanted to see what I could pull out of them. But I wanted them also to look at the land. So Joe asked me to read some, and I'm not comfortable reading, but I will read a very short portion for you of when Caroline Tompkins gets, at the end of the day, and Danby Tompkins, and you will recognize that I have changed the names of some people to use our town names. When Caroline and Danby settled in their blankets, he looked tired from the day, but not too unhappy. Caroline turned to him and asked, "Do you think they mind?" "Who?" he asked, wondering what she had been thinking. "The Indians, you know, the Sioux, the Crows, the Blackfeet, whoever is out there on the land." "Mind about what?" he asked, smiling to himself at the ways this woman he had married so long ago could still surprise him. "Are coming here, you know, going across their land." "Well, why should he?" he answered slowly, wondering if he was about to tangle with one of what they called Caroline's big questions. He could think of many times she had posed issues to him as if he had the answer or the way to right the wrong. He thought of their discussions of slavery, about which he agreed with her, about the value of missionary work, about which he disagreed but had not pushed his point. And then there was women's education and voting. This woman he had married long ago had become a complex individual, always challenging. "Well, they were here first, weren't they?" she asked. "They live here," she said emphatically. "So," he said, "so that makes this their land, doesn't it?" "How could it be theirs?" he said. "They move about. They don't have houses as we do." "But they have families," Caroline said, "and they move about with them." "That hardly seems like ownership to me, Caroline, and I'm a fair man." "Of course you're a fair man." "Well," and his voice trailed off. He wanted to sleep. "They might have other ideas about these things. They might have their own ideas," she added. "Caroline," he said, "they are savages. They're not even Christians. I know they don't have what we have. But what if they have something else?" She paused and added, "And I don't know about savages." "They are not like us," he said, thinking this might well be the end of the conversation, although his mind had been unsettled about the Indians. He had thought of some of the same things as he had ridden his horse across the land, but he enjoyed sparring with Caroline, and he was willing to hear her out. "But of course we have a right to cross the land. The Indians, well, some of them requested teaching, and we are bringing them education and religion," he added. "And government, isn't that important?" Caroline shifted her body a bit away from him. Then she turned and said, "Perhaps. But walking, I think of these things, and I think that there are many ways of living. She looked down and saw that Dan Tompkins, after his long day tending cattle, driving the wagon, and dealing with life on the trail, had fallen asleep. This is my way of trying to raise the issue of who is on the land. And I do it a couple of other times in the book by these people who are charging forward part of America's manifest destiny, that we owned and belonged, all of this land owned and belonged to us. And they did so in the best of motives because they thought they were doing the right thing. But I'm not sure that they always knew what they were doing. And I'm not sure they had the time to think about it. They were walking every day, all day long, whenever they could. They did not stop on Sunday for church, and they kept going. So I'm interested in what the dozen women on the trip thought about. I'm interested in how they managed. I'm interested in who they were and how they grew across the country. Some of the women remained pretty much themselves. There's one cranky lady I like very much. One woman, one young girl, grows tremendously on the trip. And although she was not the person I started out writing about, she became the hero to me, and I rather like that. Everyone in Lamentations is listed on the census that Elijah White took in 1842 in October. They started walking on the 17th of May. They walked until the 4th of October. But there are two people I added because there was a theme I wanted to enter. And I thought my job was to ask, what were the women thinking about? Where were they going? Where were they headed? What did they see? How did they react to the land? Mary Smith saw the grandeur of nature. Caroline Tompkins saw the landscape and thought about space and crossing space. Ellen, a young girl from Ithaca, had left the academy and was going with her family west. And she was interested in exploring things and getting out of music lessons and sitting in church. And Martha, another daughter in the family, was resentful the whole way and eventually returned back to Ithaca to her lessons. So there are many different kinds of people here, and how they observe the Native Americans, how they observe the landscape, what they thought about in terms of what they were taking with them. And I was interested in what they left behind, knowing that had they said to their neighbors, I really hate leaving this house or that cemetery, their neighbors would have said, well, stay. You don't have to go. And they didn't have to go. This was a group of literate, relatively well-off, not wealthy Americans who were moving west. And that was the story I tried to develop. I've gone blank over here, but I hope nobody else is blank. Joe, is that all right? I can't hear you.
You have been visible to me
Okay,
for the whole period, and it was fine. So
great.
maybe a slight glitch on your side. All right?
I would add that when I had a novel that I thought was a novel, I asked several of my female friends to read it. And then I took it to Jack Hopper, who is our local poet. And Jack was very enthusiastic about it. And I talked about it with Lamar Heron, who said, you know, take this to a university press. There is certainly one that will react to it. And I took it to the University of Nebraska Press, where they accepted it within a week, and they've done a wonderful job. They've been marvelous about this whole process. It's been really quite delightful. And I also showed the manuscript to John Reps, whom many of you knew. And John, at the age of 98 3/4, called me up one day and said, get this thing published. And so that's what I've tried to do. and I do it in memory of John and in thankfulness for my friends who've been very helpful. Can I turn it over to you?
All right. Well, I'm not turning it over to me, but I will momentarily facilitate a conversation a bit. I will entertain questions through the chat. A quick observation. Cindy certainly noted that she loved the selection you chose to read, and an awareness and sensitivity to the issue of Native peoples, which we appreciated. So if other attendees would like to venture in, you can, as I said, add a note to the chat section, or if you raised your hand, another Zoom feature, I can allow you momentarily to speak to our guest. I would like to, Carol,
Yes.
just not to be morbid, but what was the mortality rate on that first trip?
5 people died.
5 people died.
That's 5 out of 109. One was a baby who was ailing, and this is all true. This information comes from the trail guide that Madoram Crawford wrote. She was ailing and she died. And the problem for that family was they were not very far along and they decided to turn around, but they had to leave the grave behind them. Then there was a shooting, an accidental shooting, and someone died. And that's in the trail information. So most of the events in this book are true. The stories of the women are not true. That's what I've added to this. And I would like to say it was a joy to write. It's a lot easier. It was a lot easier for me than writing history because I had these wonderful characters and they kept talking to me, and that was great fun. So things like the killing of the dogs, that was true. The death of Bailey being shot. The return of the Lancasters turning back. They were not so far that they didn't have to turn back. They could turn back. The 2 captives who were dumped on this company as they were near the Rockies. That's a true thing that happened. And then there is a romance between Madoram Crawford, the writer of the account, and one of these, and one of the young women who is dumped on the company, and they get married 3 weeks after they get to Oregon, and that's in the records. There's a courtship by a widow, by Mr. Trask, and that's true. And indeed, they get married 3 weeks after they get there. The episode at Salmon Falls, which I found hard to write, but also I knew I was going to write it. The episode at Salmon Falls did not happen on this trip. It happened in 1854, exactly the way I described it. And it was in a diary from 1854. And that I thought was important to do. The fighting between Elijah White and Langford Hastings over who would run this company. Everybody decided that they would have a company, which the Mountain Men also had. They had a company constitution, and they elected Elijah White the leader for the first month. And he expected to be elected every month thereafter, but he wasn't, because there was someone named Langford Hastings who joined the company late. And Langford Hastings is known in history as the man who wrote The Emigrant's Guide to California, which is the guide that the Donners followed, excuse me, which ended quite badly for them. Hastings was a charlatan. He had never taken this trip he made a guide to. He also ended up fighting on the Confederate side on the Civil War, went to Brazil, and they had slaves in Brazil, and then he dies in Brazil. So he's a counter figure to Elijah White. but they're contesting each other is true. The drowning at the Willamette Falls at the very end of the book is absolutely true. It's in the records and it's in the Oregon histories. And the weather and the trail conditions are pretty much true. There are things that I fictionalized, but these are the things that come out of the records.
Okay. That leads to one of the comments and questions from an attendee. How did you feel post-product venturing onto the dark side? And how do you feel now that you're on the other side?
I loved it. I've written some history since this was published, some historical pamphlets. I like doing both. And I understand why historians don't like a lot of historical fiction. And you probably all remember the movie Lincoln. There is a historical fact in that that's wrong, and it's driven everybody crazy since then, about the Emancipation Proclamation. Connecticut did not vote against it, but in the movie it did in order to create tension. I can't do that. I can't do an absolute wrong thing. But I embellished on the right things, and I hope I did it well.
Okay.
Right. Correctly.
Okay.
But I like it here on the dark side.
Here's a comment and a question from an attendee. The book certainly makes vivid issues like, and a quote, who owns this land? But another of its virtues is the way your women and girls and their outlooks come to life. Are you, as I hope, that is the viewer, working on another historical novel?
No. I have a subject. I'm not sure I'm up to it. But I love doing this.
Okay. Well, don't put it aside just yet. Okay. Here's a comment or a question. It's a bit long, so I'll try to summarize it briefly. In this case, isn't the case between that the radical split between historical documents and interpretations is too sharp? After all, in anthropology, we speak directly to people, document observations, etc. Yet you write about them interpretably, filling in blanks, creating structures and patterns. So even direct observations are not simply rendered as empirical fact. Okay. There are big differences between debates of historical research and writing that conditions your judgment about what are plausible ways of threading this information together to help us make sense of what otherwise is silence. It's a long observation that I take simply validates the kinds of work you're trying to do.
No, none of the women on this trip has left off a word. And I felt that I had the right to use the material in order to give them all both personalities and words of the things that I thought each of these different women would be thinking and saying. I can't tell you I'm right. They might have been totally different in character, but I tried not to make more of the I tried to use as much of the history as carefully as possible. And there are patterns, certainly, but I'm not an anthropologist. And really what I wanted to do was to hear the women speak. There are many, many women's diaries of women that kept by women after 1842. There is one from a woman named Rebecca Ketchum from Ithaca, New York, and she went in the 1850s. Most of those women diaries, which are wonderful to read, are observing and describing. And what I wanted to get into was past the description. We had to walk so far and what it meant. So I was trying to get beneath the descriptive level to find out what these people were thinking about. And you know, that's what a novelist, I think, does. And I don't know if I succeeded, but I hope so.
Okay. Thank
Maybe
you.
that's a hard question.
Okay. We have one of the attendees, Timothy Mount, wanted to ask a question. Timothy, did I unmute you?
Yes, I hope so.
Yes, go ahead.
So, Carol, that was very interesting. I have your book, but I have not yet read it because I'm going to give it to my wife for Christmas. But I wondered if you could tell us something about the sort of daily routine. You know, how often they stopped, and how did they organize their meals, and did they live off the land, or did they bring most of the food with them?
That's hard for me to answer because that's the kind of nitty-gritty that's in a lot of novels about going west and is in the diaries. And I wanted to go somewhere else, but I can tell you that they usually got up early. Usually they had a cooked breakfast if it wasn't raining. Usually they stopped in the middle of the day, especially when it was hot, and had a long rest in the middle. And they went as long as they could. Some days they went 22 miles a day. That's a long day of walking. I couldn't do that. I couldn't have done that 30 years ago. They took food with them, but they certainly didn't take a balanced diet with them. So they would have taken things that would travel, such as a keg of flour. They took tinned fruits that's often spoiled. They took dry fruits. But indeed, everything they took with them had to be carried in some fashion. And their wagons gave out on this trip because on this first crossing of families and wagons, there was no trail after you got after you got over the South Pass. You went along the Green River and then you got to the Snake River. And once you got into Oregon, there was no established trail. And their wagons came apart and they left everything behind. I have one other thing I'm going to say, and it's not what you asked, but that is I've had interesting comments from women about this book, but I've had more thoughtful and more interesting and more detailed comments from men. I didn't know if I was writing a book that would be classified as a woman's book, but according to Jack Hopper and to John Reps and to others, it's not just a woman's book. It's a look into women's lives in the 19th century as they were dismantling their own life and going to create a new one. Thank you for your question.
Okay, great. Here's a factual question, or not a fact about the book. Well, one viewer wanted to know who are the two fictional characters that you added to the...
I'm glad you asked. I added Susanna and Lorenzo Cooch. And I added them for the very specific reason that one of the reasons people went to Oregon or to Washington or to California was to get away from the slavery issue. And the Cooches raised the issue of Black people going. In Oregon, there was a law by the time they started passing laws in 1844 that no Black person could stay in Oregon for more than 6 months, or else they would be whipped and then they would be forced out of the state. That law was repealed several months later, but the feeling was for many of these people that they didn't want to take the issue of slavery with them. And some of them were escaping the fact that by the 1840s, the issue of slavery was so intense in this country. Those who were protecting it and those who were morally and morally opposed to it, that they didn't want to find themselves in the position of having to fight for it. And so I introduced Lorenzo and Susanna to introduce the problem of Blacks going west. Many Blacks did go west, but you had to have enough of enough money in order to get yourself outfitted to go. There weren't that many Blacks who were doing that, and so I put them in this novel, and they are my two made-up characters. And I'm trying very hard not to tell Mr. Mount, whose wife is going to read this book after Christmas, that indeed there are things that happen, and I don't want to tell you what's going to happen.
Well, in terms of the discussion between the married couple that you read earlier, and the woman is clearly very expresses very clear awareness of the native peoples, and one is about their relationships to them. We tend to think from movies and TV shows that wagon trains across the country were constantly under attack by native peoples. And I read somewhere recently that the number of people actually killed by Indian attacks going west over 20 years was relatively small, that it wasn't this constant battle between two cultures. Did you
I think it was a battle between two cultures, but it wasn't necessarily a physical battle.
Okay.
It was the intent of the white people from the east to get west, to get land, to be there first, to be important in a new setting. But it also was their way of obliterating the cultures that were there. So I see it as a problem. The other thing that came up for me was, as the Sioux came into the camp to visit the camp, they came in, and I was interested in how these women from the East, with their long dresses and their long sleeves, and maybe they unbuttoned the top button of their blouse, how they regarded these Sioux warriors who came in wearing relatively little. And this is not discussed in historical literature, but a friend of mine gave me a portion of a diary her ancestor had kept. And the diary said something like this: they came in and they were naked. Well, they weren't totally naked, but they weren't wearing ties and shoes and our kinds of clothes. And I think there was certainly, for me, that was an interesting problem, how these people who were rather buttoned up encountered people whose clothing and whose bodies showed the scars of war, the scars of their religious observances, and whose bodies were shown. And that to me was an interesting problem.
Great. Okay. I'm having no further questions or observations from our attendees. So I will, I have to admit, Carol, in a normal course of event, at the end of a CAPE lecture, the host would present the speaker with a gift bag. I cannot extend that to you now. Perhaps sometime in the near future, perhaps, when we slip down into a more green time, we'll be able to meet again. But I want to thank you on behalf of CAPE for your presentation today, and I certainly thank our attendees for spending time with us, and hope that you will pay attention to Cindy Robinson's emails, which will keep you informed of upcoming CAPE lectures next year. So again, thank you very much, Carol. Thank you all for attending. Have a good afternoon. Have a good holiday. Have a safe holiday. Take care of friends and family and of strangers too. Goodbye.